In 1985, 7 children vanished without a trace after their school bus crashed during a fierce winter storm in rural Montana, leaving behind only twisted metal and unanswered questions that would haunt their families for decades. But 28 years later, a farmer plowing his fields unearthed something that would shatter everything the authorities had told the grieving parents about that terrible February night. Daniel Carpenter sat in his cramped office above Murphy's Diner on Main Street, the familiar hum of the coffee shop below filtering through the thin floorboards. At 54, his weathered hands moved methodically through a stack of missing person files, each folder representing another family's nightmare. Another child who had simply disappeared into the void. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through his window, casting long shadows across photographs of faces that would never age beyond the moment they were taken. On his desk, separate from all the others, sat a single file marked Sophie Carpenter. February 14, 1985. His daughter's school photos smiled back at him, gap-toothed and bright-eyed, frozen forever at 9 years old. 28 years had passed since that Valentine's Day when his little girl had climbed aboard Bus 47 for what should have been an ordinary ride home from Clearwater Elementary. 28 years since the storm had swept across the Montana plains with a fury that old-timers still talked about in hushed tones. Daniel reached for his coffee mug, his fingers trembling slightly as they always did when he lingered too long. On Sophie's case, the ceramic was chipped and stained, a relic from countless late nights spent chasing leads that went nowhere, following tips that dissolved like smoke. He had been a construction foreman back then, a man who built things with his hands, who believed that every problem had a solution if you just worked hard enough to find it. The disappearance of his daughter had taught him otherwise. The official story had been simple, almost clinical in its neatness. Bus 47, driven by veteran driver Margaret Walsh, had been traveling Route 34 when the blizzard hit with unprecedented force. Visibility dropped to 0 in minutes. The bus had skidded off the icy road, tumbling down a steep embankment into Willow Creek. When rescue teams finally reached the wreckage 12 hours later, they found Margaret Walsh's body still strapped to the driver's seat, but the 7 children aboard had vanished completely. The search had lasted 3 weeks. Hundreds of volunteers had combed through the snow-covered wilderness, following every possible lead. Search dogs had picked up scents that led nowhere. Helicopters had scanned thousands of acres. The National Guard had been called in, but Sophie Carpenter, along with 6 other children, had simply disappeared, as if they had never existed at all. The authorities had concluded that the children, likely injured and disoriented from the crash, had wandered away from the bus in the blinding storm. The sub-zero temperatures and heavy snowfall would have made survival impossible. Their bodies, the officials explained with practiced sympathy, would be found when the spring thaw came. But spring had come and gone, then summer, then fall, then another winter. Years had passed, and still, nothing. Daniel's marriage hadn't survived the strain. Sarah had wanted to move away, to start over somewhere else, to try to heal. But he couldn't leave, not while Sophie might still be out there somewhere, waiting for him to find her. He had taught himself to become an investigator, taking courses, studying techniques, transforming his grief into a methodical pursuit of truth. He had reopened the case officially 3 times, each time hitting the same dead ends, the same stone walls of bureaucratic indifference. The phone on his desk rang, jarring him from his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID and felt his heart skip a beat. Sheriff's Department. He hadn't heard from them in over 2 years. Carpenter Investigations, he answered, his voice hoarse from disuse. Dan? This is Detective Lisa Rodriguez. We need you to come down to the station. We found something. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. Detective Rodriguez had been a rookie back in 1985, barely old enough to carry a badge. Now she was one of the department's senior investigators, and she had always treated him with more respect than most of the other officers. What kind of something? A farmer north of town was plowing his back 40 this morning. His equipment caught on something buried about 3 feet down. She paused, and Daniel could hear papers rustling in the background. Dan, it's a child's backpack, pink with purple stripes. There's a name tag sewn inside. The room seemed to tilt around him. Sophie had carried a pink backpack with purple stripes. He had bought it for her himself at the start of the school year, watching her face light up as she traced the colorful pattern with her small fingers. "Whose name?" he managed to whisper. "We need you to come in and make a positive identification." "But Dan?" Detective Rodriguez's voice softened. "I think you should prepare yourself. After all these years, this changes everything." Daniel set the phone down with shaking hands and stared at Sophie's photograph. For 28 years, he had clung to the hope that she might still be alive somewhere, that the official explanation was wrong, that his little girl had somehow survived that terrible night. Now, as the Montana wind rattled his office windows, he realized he was about to learn the truth he had been seeking for nearly 3 decades. A truth that might finally bring him peace, or destroy what little hope he had left. The drive to the sheriff's department felt longer than usual, every familiar landmark along Main Street seeming to mock Daniel with memories of a different time. He passed the old Woolworths where Sophie had begged him to buy her a pet goldfish just weeks before. She disappeared. The faded red brick of Clearwater Elementary loomed ahead on his right, its empty playground swings moving gently in the afternoon breeze, like ghostly reminders of children who would never return to push them. Daniel parked his weathered pickup truck in front of the sheriff's department, a squat concrete building that had been constructed in the 1970s with all the architectural charm of a bunker. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steel himself for whatever waited inside. For 28 years he had dreamed of this moment, of finally having evidence, a real clue that might lead him to answers. Now that it was here, he felt terrified of what those answers might be. The lobby smelled of burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant. Officer Jenny Martinez, who couldn't have been more than 25, looked up from her desk with recognition. Everyone in Clearwater knew Daniel. Carpenter, the man who had never stopped looking for his daughter. "Detective Rodriguez is waiting for you in Conference Room B," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of practiced sympathy that police officers learn to use with grieving families. "She said to send you right back." Daniel walked down the familiar hallway, past the bulletin board covered with wanted posters and community notices. He had walked this same path countless times over the years, each visit representing another dead end, another false hope. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow that made the beige walls look even more depressing. Detective Lisa Rodriguez stood as he entered the conference room. At 45, she had the bearing of someone who had seen too much but still cared deeply about her job. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held a mixture of professional composure and genuine compassion. On the table between them sat a clear evidence bag containing what appeared to be a child's backpack, muddy and partially deteriorated, but still recognizably pink with purple stripes. "Dan, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat across from her. "I know this must be difficult." Daniel stared at the backpack through the plastic, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The purple stripes were faded now, and the pink fabric was stained. Dark brown in places, but he recognized it immediately. He had helped Sophie pack it on that last morning, watching her carefully arrange her pencils and notebooks, making sure her favorite eraser, shaped like a strawberry, was in the front pocket. "That's Sophie's," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I bought it for her at the start of the school year. She was so proud of it." Detective Rodriguez nodded and pulled out a small notebook. The backpack was found on Harold Peterson's farm, about 12 miles northeast of where the bus crash occurred. Hank's been farming that land for over 40 years, and he swears nothing like this has ever been buried there before. 12 miles? Daniel looked up sharply. How could Sophie's backpack end up 12 miles from the crash site? The official report said the children wandered away in the storm, but 12 miles? In a blizzard? That's impossible. That's what we need to figure out, Detective Rodriguez said carefully. Dan, I have to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever had any contact with Harold Peterson? Any reason he might know about Sophie or have access to her belongings? Daniel shook his head immediately. I've heard the name, but I've never met him. I know he has a farm north of town, but I've never been out there. Why would he have Sophie's backpack? Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel's face. Because, Dan, the backpack wasn't just lying on the surface. According to Hank, his plow caught it about 3 feet underground. Someone buried it there, recently. The word recently hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Daniel felt the room spin slightly as the implications sank in. Someone had kept Sophie's backpack for 28 years, then decided to bury it in Harold Peterson's field. But why now? And why there? How recently? Daniel managed to ask, his mouth suddenly dry. Detective Rodriguez consulted her notes. The soil analysis isn't complete yet, but the preliminary examination suggests it was buried within the last few months, maybe even weeks. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Dan, someone has been holding on to evidence from your daughter's disappearance for nearly 3 decades. Someone who knows exactly what happened that night. Daniel's hands clenched into fists on the table. I want to talk to Peterson. I want to see his farm, see exactly where this was found. We're already planning to interview him again tomorrow morning. But Dan, you can't be involved in the official investigation. You know that. Rodriguez's tone was firm but sympathetic. However, Hank Peterson specifically asked if he could speak with you. He says he has something else to show you, something he didn't want to mention to us until he talked to you first. The drive to Peterson's farm took them through rolling hills, covered in the golden stubble of harvested wheat. Daniel followed Detective Rodriguez's unmarked sedan in his pickup, his mind racing with possibilities. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of winter. It reminded him too much of that February day in 1985, when the world had turned white and cold and taken his daughter away. Harold Peterson's farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, a modest 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. The barn behind it was massive and well-maintained, suggesting that while Hank might not spend much on his house, he took care of his equipment. As they pulled up, an elderly man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Harold Peterson was exactly what Daniel had expected a Montana farmer to look like, tall and lean, with weathered skin that spoke of decades working under the sun. His gray hair was thin on top but thick around the sides, and his blue eyes held the kind of steady gaze that came from a lifetime of dealing with the unpredictable nature of farming. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had probably been red once but had faded to a dull pink. "Mr. Carpenter," Hank said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm real sorry about all this. Can't imagine what you've been going through all these years." Daniel shook the farmer's hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in the man's voice. "Detective Rodriguez says you found my daughter's backpack in your field." Hank nodded gravely. "Come on, I'll show you exactly where." He gestured toward a large tractor parked nearby. Was plowing the back 40, getting ready for next season's planting. My plow caught on something about 3 feet down. At first I thought it was just an old tree root or maybe some scrap metal. But when I dug it out, he shook his head. "Well, you saw what I found." They walked across the field, their boots crunching on the dry earth. The October sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the farmland. In the distance, Daniel could see the mountains that surrounded the Clearwater Valley, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Right here," Hank said, stopping, beside a section of recently turned soil. "This is where the plow caught it." He looked at Daniel with troubled eyes. "Mr. Carpenter, I need to tell you something I didn't mention to the detective yet." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. "What is it?" Hank glanced back toward where Detective Rodriguez was examining the surrounding area, then leaned closer to Daniel. "This isn't the first time I've found something that didn't belong on my land. About 5 years ago, I was digging a new well over near the north fence line. Found a child's shoe buried about 6 feet down. Little girl's shoe, looked old. I figured it was just something that got lost and buried over the years, so I threw it away." He paused, his face grim. "Now I'm wondering if I should have kept it." Daniel's blood turned to ice. "What kind of shoe?" "Little pink sneaker," Hank said, his voice heavy with regret. "Had a cartoon character on it, looked like one of those My Little Pony things my granddaughter used to love. Size probably fit a 7 or 8-year-old. Daniel's knees nearly buckled. Sophie had been wearing pink sneakers with rainbow dash on them the day she disappeared. He had bought them for her birthday just 2 months before the bus crash, and she had insisted on wearing them every single day, even though the Montana winter made them completely impractical. "Mr. Peterson," Daniel said, his voice shaking, "I need you to think very carefully. Do you remember exactly where you found that shoe? Could you show me the spot?" Hank nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was revealing. "It's about a quarter-mile from here, near the old fence line that borders the Hendricks property. But Mr. Carpenter, that land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather worked that soil, then my father, then me. If there were children buried on my land—" His voice trailed off, the implications too horrible to voice. Detective Rodriguez approached them, having finished her preliminary examination of the area. "Everything all right over here? You both look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel quickly explained what Hank had just told him about the shoe. Rodriguez's expression grew grim as she pulled out her notebook and began taking detailed notes. "Mr. Peterson, we're going to need to bring in a forensics team to conduct a thorough search of your property. I hope you understand." "Of course," Hank said immediately. "Whatever you need to do. If those children are on my land, their families deserve to know." He paused, looking directly at Daniel. "I've got something else to show you, but it's back at the house." They walked back across the field in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The farmhouse looked different to Daniel now, less like a simple homestead, and more like a crime scene. The idea that Sophie might be buried somewhere on this land was almost too much to bear, but it was also the first real lead he had had in 28 years. Inside the farmhouse, Hank led them to a cluttered kitchen that smelled of coffee and bacon grease. On the counter sat a small wooden box, the kind used to store fishing tackle or tools. Hank opened it carefully and pulled out a tarnished piece of metal about the size of a quarter. "Found this in the same area where I discovered the backpack," he said, handing it to Daniel. "Wasn't sure what it was at first, but when I cleaned it up, I realized it was some kind of badge or pin." Daniel took the metal piece and held it up to the kitchen light. Despite the tarnish and dirt, he could make out the shape of a star with words etched around the edges. As he read the inscription, his blood ran cold. Junior Safety Patrol, Clearwater Elementary. Sophie had been a safety patrol member. She had been so proud of that little badge, pinning it to her jacket every morning and making sure it was perfectly straight before she left for school. She had worn it on the bus that final day. Daniel was certain of it. "There's more," Hank said quietly, reaching back into the box. He pulled out what appeared to be several small pieces of blue and red fabric, faded and worn, but still recognizable, as part of a school uniform. These were tangled up with the backpack. Looked like they'd been torn from something larger. Detective Rodriguez took photos of each item while Daniel stared at the fabric pieces. The colors matched the Clearwater Elementary School uniforms perfectly. Red polo shirt, blue jumper for the girls, blue slacks for the boys. These weren't random pieces of cloth, they were fragments of his daughter's clothing. "Mr. Peterson," Rodriguez said, closing her camera, "I need to ask you some difficult questions. Have you ever noticed anyone on your property who didn't belong here? Any vehicles? Any suspicious activity, especially around the times when these items might have been buried?" Hank shook his head slowly. "This farm is pretty isolated. My nearest neighbor is over a mile away. I would have noticed strangers." He paused, thinking, "Although there was something strange about 3 months ago. I was coming back from town late one evening, and I saw headlights out in the back field. By the time I got my boots on and went to check, whoever it was had gone. Found some tire tracks, but they were gone after the next rain." 3 months ago, Daniel repeated. That timing aligned perfectly with when the backpack had been buried. Rodriguez made more notes. "We'll need to bring in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. If there are more remains on this property, we'll find them." She looked at both men seriously. "But I have to warn you both. If we do find bodies, this becomes a homicide investigation. And after 28 years, whoever did this has had a lot of time to cover their tracks." The forensics team arrived at Peterson's farm before dawn the next morning, their white vans and equipment trailers looking starkly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the Montana countryside. Daniel had barely slept, spending the night. in his truck parked at the end of Hank's driveway, unable to leave, but knowing he couldn't interfere with the official investigation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the state's leading forensic anthropologist, supervised the setup of the ground-penetrating radar equipment. A small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades uncovering buried secrets. Daniel watched from a distance as she directed her team across the field, methodically scanning the earth for any anomalies that might indicate disturbed soil. "Mr. Carpenter," Detective Rodriguez approached him with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You should probably get some rest. This could take days." Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully but shook his head. "I can't leave. Not now. Not when we're this close to finding out what really happened." The first significant discovery came around 10 in the morning. One of the radar operators called out excitedly, pointing to a section of the screen that showed a clear rectangular anomaly about 6 feet underground. Dr. Chen hurried over, studying the readings with practiced eyes. "Definitely something artificial down there," she announced. "Size and shape suggest it could be a container of some kind. Maybe a wooden box or metal chest." As the excavation team began carefully digging, Daniel found himself holding his breath. Each shovelful of dirt brought them closer to answers he had sought for nearly 3 decades, but also closer to a truth that might be too painful to bear. Hank Peterson stood beside him, his weathered face creased with worry. "I keep thinking about all the years I farmed this land, never knowing what was underneath. Makes a man question everything he thought he knew about his own property." The digging continued for hours, the team working with archaeological precision to preserve any evidence they might uncover. Finally, around 3 in the afternoon, one of the excavators called out, "We've got something!" Dr. Chen climbed down into the pit, which was now about 8 feet deep. She knelt beside what appeared to be the corner of a wooden crate, her gloved hands carefully brushing away the remaining soil. "It's a child's coffin," she announced, her voice carrying across the field. "Handmade, looks like pine wood. Very old." Daniel felt the world tilt around him. A coffin meant someone had taken the time to properly bury a child, not just hide a body. It suggested planning, care, perhaps even remorse. But it also meant that at least one of the missing children was definitely dead. "Can you tell how long it's been here?" Rodriguez called down. "The wood has aged significantly, but the soil conditions have preserved it better than I would have expected. I'd estimate 25 to 30 years, which fits your timeline." Dr. Chen continued her examination. "There's an inscription carved into the lid, but it's faint. I'll need to clean it up before I can read it." As they carefully lifted the coffin from the ground, Daniel noticed something that made his heart race. The size was wrong. It was too small for a 9-year-old child like Sophie. This coffin had been made for someone much younger, perhaps a 5 or 6-year-old. "Detective," Daniel said, approaching Rodriguez as she supervised the coffin's removal. "That's not big enough for Sophie. One of the other children on the bus was smaller, Timothy." "Chen. He was only 6 years old, just started 1st grade. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Which means there are likely more graves on this property." As if to confirm her words, another radar operator called out from a different section of the field. "I've got 2 more anomalies over here. Same depth, similar size and shape." The sun was beginning to set by the time they had marked all the potential grave sites. The radar had identified 7 distinct anomalies scattered across a 2-acre area of Peterson's back field. 7 anomalies for 7 missing children. Dr. Chen emerged from her examination of the first coffin, her face pale despite her years of experience with death. The inscription on the lid reads, "Timothy Chen, age 6, taken too soon." There's also a date, February 14th, 1985, Valentine's Day. The day the bus had crashed, the day 7 children had vanished into a blizzard that should have killed them quickly. Instead, someone had taken them, kept them, and eventually buried them with enough care to carve their names into handmade coffins. "Doctor," Daniel said, his voice barely steady, "are there any remains inside?" Dr. Chen hesitated before answering. "Yes, Mr. Carpenter, there are. But Mr. Carpenter, these children didn't die in a bus crash. Someone killed them, and from what I can see so far, it didn't happen quickly." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. For 28 years he had hoped, against hope, that Sophie might still be alive somewhere. Now he was faced with the horrible reality that not only was she dead, but she had suffered before she died. As the forensics team prepared to excavate the remaining graves, one question burned in Daniel's mind. Who had done this to these innocent children, and why had they waited 28 years to start moving the evidence? The excavation of the second grave began at first light the following morning. Daniel had spent another sleepless night in his truck, haunted by the image of Timothy Chen's small coffin and the terrible implications of Dr. Chen's findings. The October air was bitter cold, with frost covering the equipment and a low fog rolling across Peterson's fields, like ghostly fingers reaching up from the disturbed earth. This time, Daniel wasn't alone in his vigil. Word had spread through Clearwater. Overnight and by sunrise, nearly a dozen people had gathered at the edge of Peterson's property. He recognized most of them, the parents and siblings of the other missing children, all drawn by the same desperate need to finally know the truth. Margaret Walsh's younger sister, Patricia, stood near the fence line, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Margaret had been the bus driver who died in the crash, and Patricia had spent 28 years believing her sister had failed to protect the children in her care. Now, faced with evidence that something far more sinister had occurred, she looked both relieved and horrified. "Danny," she called softly as he approached, "is it true? About Timothy?" Daniel nodded, unable to find words that could adequately convey what they had discovered. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of a complicated grief, mourning not just for the dead children but for all the years she had blamed her sister for their deaths. The second coffin emerged from the ground around noon, this one slightly larger than Timothy's, but still heartbreakingly small. Dr. Chen worked with the same methodical care, carefully cleaning the dirt from the inscription carved into the pine lid. "Maria Santos, age 7, beloved daughter," she read aloud, her voice carrying across the silent field. "Same date, February 14th, 1985. Daniel remembered Maria, a shy little girl with dark pigtails who had always sat near the front of the bus. Her parents had moved back to Mexico 2 years after her disappearance, unable to bear the constant reminders of their lost daughter. They would never know that she had finally been found. As the day progressed, a pattern emerged that chilled everyone present. Each coffin was handmade with obvious care, each inscription personally crafted, each burial conducted with a strange sort of reverence that seemed completely at odds with the horror of what had been done to the children. Whoever had killed them had also taken the time to memorialize them, as if seeking some kind of twisted redemption for their crimes. Detective Rodriguez pulled Daniel aside as the fourth coffin was being excavated. "Dan, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In all your years of investigating Sophie's disappearance, did you ever come across anyone who seemed to know more than they were letting on? Anyone who showed unusual interest in the case or tried to steer you in a particular direction?" Daniel considered the question, running through decades of conversations with police officers, search volunteers, and well-meaning townspeople. "There was someone," he said slowly. "Frank Holloway, the former sheriff. He retired about 10 years ago, but he was always strange about the case. Whenever I tried to get him to reopen the investigation, he would get defensive, almost angry. Said I needed to accept that the children were dead and move on." "Frank Holloway," Rodriguez repeated, making a note. "I remember him. He was sheriff during the original investigation in 1985. More than that," Daniel continued, his mind racing as connections began to form. "Frank owned property out this way back then. His family had a hunting cabin somewhere near Peterson's land. I remember because Sophie and I used to drive past it on our way to the fishing spots along Willow Creek." Rodriguez's expression sharpened. "Do you know if he still owns that property?" Before Daniel could answer, a commotion erupted from the excavation site. Dr. Chen was standing beside the fourth coffin, her face white with shock. She was holding something small and metallic in her gloved hand, something that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in sharp, painful flashes. "Detective Rodriguez," Dr. Chen called, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "You need to see this. I found it clutched in the child's hand. As they approached, Daniel could see what had caused Dr. Chen's reaction. In her palm lay a sheriff's department badge, tarnished and old but still clearly identifiable. The number engraved on its surface was clearly visible, 047. "That's Frank Holloway's badge number," Rodriguez said quietly. "I remember it from his retirement ceremony." Daniel felt rage building in his chest like a physical force. Frank Holloway, the man who had been trusted to find the missing children, had been the one who killed them. The man who had lectured Daniel about moving on and accepting their deaths had been carrying the secret of their murders for 28 years. "Where is Holloway now?" Daniel asked, his voice dangerous. Rodriguez was already pulling out her phone. "According to his pension records, he moved to Arizona about 5 years ago. But Dan, we have to do this by the book. We can't afford to let him slip away on a technicality." As the sun began to set over Peterson's field, casting long shadows across the scattered grave sites, Daniel realized that the truth he had sought for so long was finally within reach. But with that truth came a new and terrible question. If Frank Holloway had killed the children in 1985, why had someone been moving evidence on Peterson's land just 3 months ago? Detective Rodriguez's phone call to the Arizona authorities revealed a disturbing truth that sent shockwaves through the investigation. Frank Holloway had been found dead in his Phoenix apartment 6 months earlier, an apparent suicide by gunshot. He had left behind a rambling, incoherent note about paying for his sins, and the children calling to him in his dreams, but nothing that explicitly confessed to the murders. 6 months ago, Daniel repeated, pacing back and forth beside his truck as Rodriguez relayed the information. "That's 3 months before someone started moving evidence on Peterson's land. Frank couldn't have been involved in that." "Which means he had an accomplice," Rodriguez said grimly. "Someone who knew about the murders, knew where the bodies were buried, and decided to start moving them after Frank's death." As if summoned by their conversation, a dusty pickup truck turned into Peterson's driveway. Daniel recognized the vehicle immediately, a faded blue Ford that belonged to Tom Brennan, Clearwater's current sheriff and Frank Holloway's hand-picked successor. Brennan had been Frank's deputy back in 1985, a young officer eager to please his mentor and advance his career. Sheriff Brennan climbed out of his truck with the slow, deliberate movements of a man trying to appear calm while his world collapsed around him. At 55, he had the soft build of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the field, but his eyes held the sharp wariness of a cornered animal. "Lisa," he called to Rodriguez, his voice carrying forced casualness. "Heard you found something interesting out here. Thought I should come take a look." Daniel noticed immediately that Brennan avoided eye contact with him, focusing instead on the excavation site where the forensics team continued their grim work. The sheriff's hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette, a nervous habit Daniel had never seen him display before. "Tom," Rodriguez said carefully, "we found Frank Holloway's badge in one of the graves. We need to talk." Brennan's face went pale, but he managed a weak laugh. "Frank's badge? That's impossible. He turned in all his equipment when he retired." "Badge number 047, Rodriguez continued, watching Brennan's reaction closely. "Found it, clutched in the hand of an 8-year-old boy named Michael Torres. Want to explain how it got there?" The cigarette fell from Brennan's lips, landing in the dirt at his feet. For a long moment he stared at the excavation site, his shoulders sagging as if carrying an enormous weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I told Frank this day would come. I told him 30 years ago that we couldn't keep this secret forever." Daniel felt his blood turn to ice. "We?" Brennan looked at him directly for the first time, and Daniel saw decades of guilt and terror in the sheriff's eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. We responded to the bus crash that night, found Margaret Walsh dead behind the wheel. But the children, God help me, the children were still alive." Rodriguez had her phone out, recording everything. "Go on, Tom?" "They were hurt, some of them pretty bad, but they were alive. Frank said we had to call for ambulances, get them to the hospital. But then," Brennan's voice broke, "then he saw something in the back of the bus. A bag of money. Must have been $50,000. Turns out Margaret Walsh had been skimming from the school district's accounts for years, probably planning to run off somewhere. The pieces began falling into place in Daniel's mind with horrible clarity. Frank decided to take the money. Brennan nodded miserably. Said nobody would miss it, that Margaret was dead so she couldn't tell anyone about it. But the children had seen us take it. Little Sophie, she kept asking when we were going to call the ambulances. Frank said we couldn't let them go, not when they could identify us as thieves. So you murdered 7 innocent children for $50,000, Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. I didn't want to, Brennan cried, tears streaming down his face. Frank said it was the only way. Said we'd go to prison if anyone found out about the money. He made it sound like we didn't have a choice. Rodriguez stepped closer to Brennan. How did you kill them, Tom? Frank gave them something, said it would help with their pain from the crash. They just went to sleep. We told ourselves they would have died anyway from their injuries. Brennan was sobbing now, years of suppressed guilt pouring out. Frank said we had to make it look like they wandered away from the bus, died in the storm. We buried them on his family's old hunting property, thought nobody would ever find them. There. But someone did find them, Daniel said. 3 months ago, someone started moving the bodies to Peterson's land. That was you, wasn't it? Brennan nodded through his tears. After Frank killed himself, I got scared. His suicide note mentioned the children, and I was afraid someone would start investigating his old cases. The hunting property is going to be developed, turned into a subdivision. I couldn't risk the bodies being discovered during construction. So you dug up 7 children and moved them to an innocent man's farm, Rodriguez said with disgust. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. I thought if they were found on Peterson's land, suspicion would fall on him instead of us. Brennan looked at Daniel with desperate eyes. I never meant for any of this to happen. Those children have haunted me every day for 28 years. As Rodriguez called for backup to arrest Brennan, Daniel stared at the sheriff who had spent 3 decades pretending to help investigate his daughter's disappearance while knowing exactly where she was buried. The truth he had sought for so long was finally his, but it brought no peace, only a rage so pure and white-hot that it threatened to consume him entirely. The arrest of Sheriff Tom Brennan sent shockwaves through Clearwater that reverberated far beyond the small Montana town. Local news crews descended on Peterson's farm like vultures, their satellite trucks and camera equipment turning the quiet rural property into a media circus. Daniel found himself thrust into the spotlight he had never wanted, fielding questions from reporters who seemed more interested in sensationalism than justice. How does it feel to finally know the truth? A young journalist from Helena asked, shoving a microphone toward Daniel's face as he tried to leave the farm. Are you planning to sue the sheriff's department? Daniel pushed past her without answering. Lawsuits and media attention couldn't bring Sophie back. Nothing could undo the 28 years of not knowing, the decades of false hope and misplaced blame. The truth was supposed to set him free, but all he felt was a crushing emptiness where his purpose used to be. The excavation continued for 3 more days under heavy security. One by one, the remaining children were recovered. Michael Torres, age 8, Jennifer Walsh, age 9, Margaret Walsh's own niece who had been riding the bus that day, Kevin Morrison, age 7, Lisa Chen, age 8, Timothy's older sister, and finally, in the 7th grave, Sophie Carpenter. Daniel stood at the edge of the excavation site as Dr. Chen carefully lifted his daughter's small coffin from the ground. The pine box looked impossibly tiny, a cruel reminder of how young Sophie had been when her life was stolen. The inscription on the lid was longer than the others. Sophie Carpenter, age 9, Daddy's little girl, forever in our hearts. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Even in death, even while committing the most heinous of crimes, Frank Holloway had recognized that Sophie was someone's beloved daughter. The contradiction between the care taken in crafting the coffins and the brutality of the murders spoke to a twisted psyche that Daniel would never understand. I'm sorry, Dr. Chen said quietly as she supervised the coffin's removal. No parent should have to go through this. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his office above Murphy's Diner, surrounded by 28 years of investigation files that were now obsolete. Every lead he had followed, every theory he had pursued, every sleepless night spent wondering what had happened to Sophie, All of it had been rendered meaningless by Tom Brennan's confession. His phone rang constantly, reporters and lawyers and distant relatives all wanting to discuss what came next. But Daniel couldn't think about the future. He was trapped in February 14th, 1985, replaying that final morning with Sophie over and over in his mind. She had been excited about Valentine's Day, had made him a card at school with a crayon drawing of the two of them holding hands. "I love you bigger than the whole world, Daddy," she had written in her careful 9-year-old handwriting. He still had that card, carried it in his wallet every day for 28 years. The knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Patricia Walsh stood in the hallway, her eyes red from crying but her expression determined. "Danny," she said, "we need to talk. All of us, all the families. This isn't over." Daniel looked at her questioningly. "Tom Brennan confessed to moving the bodies and helping Frank cover up the murders," Patricia continued. "But he's claiming he wasn't involved in the actual killings. Says Frank acted alone while he waited in the patrol car. Do you believe that?" Daniel considered the question. In his heart he knew the answer, and it filled him with a cold determination that surprised him with its intensity. "No," he said finally. "I don't believe that at all." The meeting took place in the basement of Clearwater Presbyterian Church, the same church where memorial services had been held for the missing children 28 years earlier. Patricia Walsh had organized it, reaching out to every family affected by the tragedy. Despite the years and the pain, they came. Some drove from other states, others from just across town, but they all shared the same burning need for complete justice. Daniel recognized most of the faces, though time had aged them all. Maria Santos's uncle Roberto had flown in from Tucson. The Torres family had driven up from Billings. Even Jennifer Walsh's father, Patricia's brother-in-law, had come despite his failing health. They sat in a circle of folding chairs, their voices echoing in the empty fellowship hall. "Tom Brennan is lying," Patricia began without preamble. "I've known him since we were kids. He was always Frank Holloway's shadow, would do anything Frank told him to do. The idea that he just sat in a patrol car while Frank murdered 7 children is ridiculous." Roberto Santos nodded grimly. "My sister Maria's body showed signs of prolonged restraint. The forensic report mentioned rope burns on her wrists and ankles. That's not something one person could have managed alone with 7 injured children." Daniel had seen the same reports. The forensic evidence painted a picture far different from Brennan's confession. The children hadn't died immediately after the bus crash, as he claimed. They had been held captive for days, possibly weeks, before finally being killed. "There's something else," said Ellen Torres, Michael's mother. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she spoke. "I hired a private investigator to look into Frank Holloway's finances from 1985. 3 weeks after the bus crash, he made a cash deposit of $47,000 into a personal account." "47,000, Daniel repeated. "Brennan said they found $50,000 in Margaret Walsh's bag, which means they split the money," Patricia concluded. "Frank got 47, Tom got 3, partners in every sense of the word." The one group spent the next 2 hours comparing notes, sharing information that their individual grief had prevented them from piecing together before. A pattern emerged that painted both Holloway and Brennan as active participants in not just the cover-up, but the murders themselves. "We need to take this to the FBI," Daniel said finally. "The local authorities can't be trusted. Too many connections. Too much history." "Already done," Ellen Torres replied, pulling out a business card. "Special Agent Jennifer Collins from the Great Falls Field Office. She's been investigating police corruption cases for 15 years. I spoke with her yesterday." As the meeting broke up, Daniel found himself walking out with Patricia Walsh. The October night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant against the black Montana sky. "Margaret would have fought them," Patricia said quietly. "If she had still been alive when they found that money, she would have fought to protect those children. She died trying to keep that bus on the road." Daniel nodded. After 28 years of wondering, of blaming himself for not being able to find Sophie, he finally understood that the real monsters had been hiding in plain sight, wearing badges and uniforms that should have meant protection and justice. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging. or you'll join your daughter." Daniel showed the message to Patricia, who immediately called Detective Rodriguez. But as they waited for the police to arrive, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: the absolute certainty that he was finally on the right path. Someone was scared enough to threaten him, which meant there were still secrets to uncover. And after 28 years of searching for the truth, Daniel Carpenter wasn't about to stop now. Special Agent Jennifer Collins arrived in Clearwater the next morning, bringing with her a team of federal investigators and a reputation for relentless pursuit of the truth. Daniel met her at the sheriff's department, where she had commandeered the conference room and spread out decades of case files across 2 long tables. Collins was younger than Daniel had expected, probably in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance as they shook hands. She wore a no-nonsense black suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mr. Carpenter," she said, gesturing for him to sit across from her, "I've been reviewing your investigation files. 28 years of work, impressive and heartbreaking in equal measure." "Did you find anything I missed?" Daniel asked. Collins opened a thick folder and pulled out several photographs. "Actually, you found something that we've been looking for without realizing it. Do you remember this?" She showed him a photo from his files, taken in 1987 during one of his early investigations. It showed Frank Holloway's hunting cabin, a modest, log structure surrounded by pine trees. "I remember that cabin," Daniel said. "It's where Tom Brennan says they originally buried the children. I took that photo when I was trying to map all the possible locations the kids might have wandered to after the crash." "Look at the background," Collins said, pointing to the edge of the photograph. "See that blue pickup truck parked behind the cabin?" Daniel squinted at the image. There was indeed a vehicle partially visible through the trees, though he had never paid attention to it before. "What about it?" "That truck belongs to Carl Brennan, Tom's older brother. He was supposed to be in California in 1987, working construction. But here he is, at Frank Holloway's cabin, 2 years after the murders." The implications hit Daniel immediately. "How many people were involved in this?" Collins pulled out another file. "That's what we're trying to determine. Carl Brennan died in a motorcycle accident in 1995, but we've been tracking his movements. Around the time of the original murders, he had connections to several unsolved disappearances throughout the region during the 1980s. You think this was bigger than just Frank and Tom? I think Frank Holloway was running a trafficking operation, and Tom Brennan was his inside man at the sheriff's department. The bus crash was supposed to be their cover story, but something went wrong. Maybe the children saw too much, or maybe they were always intended to be victims." Daniel felt sick. The idea that Sophie's death had been part of some larger criminal enterprise was almost too horrible to contemplate. "What kind of evidence do you have?" Collins spread out several documents. Financial records showing regular cash deposits in both Frank's and Tom's accounts over a 10-year period. Correspondence between Frank and known trafficking networks in the Pacific Northwest. And this. She showed him a piece of paper that made Daniel's blood run cold. It was a list of names and ages, written in Frank Holloway's handwriting. At the top of the list were the 7 children from the bus, but below them were dozens of other names, other children spanning nearly a decade. "We believe these are victims," Collins said quietly. "Children who disappeared from across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming between 1982 and 1992, all around the same ages, all from rural areas where a missing child might not generate much attention." Daniel stared at the list, his hands trembling. "How many?" 37 names total, including your daughter." The room seemed to spin around Daniel as the full scope of the horror became clear. This wasn't just about a corrupt sheriff stealing money from a bus crash. This was about a predator who had used his badge to hunt children for years, with Tom Brennan helping to cover his tracks. "Where is Tom now?" Daniel asked. "County jail, but not for long. His lawyer is pushing for a plea deal. Reduced sentence, in exchange for information about the trafficking network." Collins looked directly at Daniel. "We need more evidence to stop that from happening. We need proof that Tom was an active participant, not just an unwilling accomplice." Daniel thought about the threatening text message, about the fear he had seen in Tom Brennan's eyes. "What do you need me to do?" Collins smiled grimly. "What you've been doing for 28 years, Mr. Carpenter. Help us find the truth." The plan Collins proposed was dangerous and potentially illegal, but Daniel didn't hesitate to agree. They would wire him for sound and arrange for him to visit Tom Brennan in jail, posing as someone willing to help with his defense in exchange for the complete truth about what had happened to the children. "Tom's desperate," Collins explained, as her technical team fitted Daniel with the recording equipment. "His lawyer is telling him that full cooperation is his only chance to avoid death row. If you can get him talking about the trafficking operation, about his brother Carl's involvement, we can build a case that will put him away forever." Daniel tested the wire, speaking softly to ensure the equipment was working properly. After 28 years of searching for answers, he was finally in a position to get them directly from one of the killers. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to have a conversation with the man who had helped murder his daughter. The Clearwater County Jail was a modern facility that had been built in the late 1990s, all concrete and steel designed to contain the worst elements of society. Tom Brennan looked haggard and defeated as he was led into the small visitor's room, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely on his diminished frame. The confident sheriff who had once commanded respect throughout the county was gone, replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of decades of unspeakable crimes. "Danny," Brennan said as he sat down across from Daniel, separated by a thick plexiglass barrier. "I heard you might be willing to help with my defense. I appreciate that, considering everything." Daniel forced himself to appear sympathetic. "I know you're not the monster here, Tom. Frank Holloway manipulated you, used your loyalty against you. But I need to understand what really happened that night. The families deserve the truth." Brennan's eyes filled with tears. "Frank said it would be simple. Take the money, report the children as missing, let everyone assume they died in the storm. But when we got them back to the cabin," his voice broke. "What happened at the cabin, Tom? Carl was there, Frank's partner in everything. He had buyers lined up, people who would pay good money for children that age. But some of the kids were hurt worse than we thought from the crash. Carl said the injured ones were worthless, that we should just get rid of them." Daniel felt bile rise in his throat but forced himself to remain calm. "How many were injured?" "3 of them. Your Sophie. She had a broken arm and a head injury. Carl said she would never sell, that she was damaged goods." Brennan was sobbing now, 28 years of guilt pouring out. "Frank agreed, said we'd keep the healthy ones for the buyers and dispose of the rest. But you killed all 7, Daniel said. Quietly. Brennan nodded miserably. "The healthy ones saw what happened to the others. They would have talked. Carl said we couldn't risk it, so we drugged them all, made it look peaceful. Frank said it was mercy." The recording device captured every word, every admission of guilt. That would ensure Tom Brennan spent the rest of his life in prison. But Daniel needed more. "How many other children, Tom? How many besides the 7 from the bus?" "Dozens," Brennan whispered. "Carl had contacts all over the region. We'd identify targets, children from broken homes or poor families who wouldn't be missed right away. Frank would use his badge to gain access, claim he was investigating reports of abuse or neglect. Most of the time, we'd take them and sell them to buyers in other states, sometimes to Mexico or Canada. And when there were no buyers?" Brennan's face crumpled completely. "Carl had a place in the mountains, a mine shaft, deep enough that nobody would ever find them." Daniel closed his eyes, fighting back the rage that threatened to overwhelm him. For nearly 3 decades, while he had been searching for his daughter, Tom Brennan had been sitting in the sheriff's office, pretending to help while knowing exactly where Sophie's body lay buried. "Where is this mine shaft, Tom?" The abandoned copper mine lay hidden in the Bitterroot Mountains, 30 miles north of Clearwater, accessible only by a treacherous dirt road that wound through dense forest and rocky terrain. Daniel stood with Agent Collins and her team at the mouth of the mine shaft, staring into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams whole. "According to the Geological Survey, this shaft goes down about 200 feet, Collins said, checking her equipment one final time. "It was abandoned in the 1960s when the copper played out. Perfect place to dispose of evidence if you didn't care about the victims ever being found." The descent into the mine was like entering hell itself. Daniel rappelled down beside the FBI's recovery team, their lights cutting through blackness that had hidden unspeakable secrets for decades. The air grew colder and thinner as they descended, and by the time they reached the bottom, Daniel's breath formed visible clouds in the frigid underground air. What they found there would haunt Daniel for the rest of his life. The mine shaft had become a tomb for at least 15 children, their remains scattered across the rocky floor where they had been thrown like discarded trash. Some still wore fragments of clothing that helped identify them as missing children from across the region. Others had been reduced to bones by time and the harsh conditions underground. "Jesus," one of the FBI agents whispered, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "How many families have been wondering about these kids for all these years?" Dr. Chen, who had descended with the team, worked methodically to catalog and recover each set of remains. Her professional composure couldn't quite hide the horror. She felt at the scope of what they had discovered. Based on the clothing and personal effects, these children range in age from 5 to 12 years old. Some of these remains have been here for decades. As the recovery operation continued, Daniel found himself thinking about all the families who would finally get answers, all the parents who had spent years wondering what had happened to their children. The pain of knowing was terrible, but the agony of not knowing was worse. Agent Collins climbed back up to the surface to coordinate with the teams processing evidence at Frank Holloway's former properties. The investigation had expanded to include 4 states and dozens of potential crime scenes. The trafficking network that Holloway and the Brennan brothers had operated was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. When Daniel finally emerged from the mine shaft 6 hours later, the Montana sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of Sophie's favorite sunset. He sat on a boulder near the mine entrance, exhausted and emotionally drained, but feeling something he hadn't experienced in 28 years: closure. His phone rang. It was Patricia Walsh. "Danny, I'm watching the news. They're saying you found more children." "How many?" "15 confirmed so far," Daniel replied. "Maybe more." "Patricia, we did it. We found them all." There was silence on the line for a long moment before Patricia spoke again, her voice thick with tears. "Margaret would be so proud of you. You never gave up. You brought them all home." As the FBI teams continued their work in the fading light, Daniel looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. For the first time since February 14, 1985, he felt at peace. Sophie was gone, and nothing could bring her back, but her killer would spend the rest of his life in prison, and the children who had been thrown away like garbage would finally receive proper burials. The investigation would continue for months, identifying victims and tracking down other members of the trafficking network. But for Daniel Carpenter, the search that had consumed nearly 3 decades of his life was finally over. Sophie could rest in peace, and so could he. The truth had set them all free.